Thank you, everyone, for joining us here. I've got with me Gwen McCausland. Is that how you say your last name? Okay, and Dr. Tom Schumacher.
Schumacher.
Just a quick bio. Gwen McCausland grew up on a farm and in her father's vet clinic in North Dakota. Sounds like a great way to grow up. In the 23 years working in museums, she spent the last 8 years as director of South Dakota Agricultural Heritage Museum. The mission is to inspire a passion for the diverse history, culture, and science of agriculture in South Dakota. Since everyone eats and most people wear clothes, especially on a day like this weekend is bringing, the museum strives to connect people to the importance of agriculture in their daily lives. Through exhibits and programming, the museum tells the stories of food and fiber producers, both past and present. And Dr. Tom Schumacher grew up on a farm with mixed cropping and beef cattle. He has a BA in biology from Bluffton University, MS in crop and soil science, and PhD in soil biophysics from Michigan State University. He is currently Professor Emeritus of Soil Science at South Dakota State University. At SDSU, he's taught courses in environmental soil management, soil physics, and crop-water relationships. His research has included studies in soil structure, soil erosion, including tillage erosion, improvement of degraded soils, and soil-plant root relationships. The results are found in 140-plus published papers. He spent 3 years teaching in Sierra Leone and a half year in South Korea. He enjoys creating salads for his family throughout the winter from an indoor garden, which sounds interesting all by itself, but that might be a story for another day. Let's get into the program here of Drowning in Dirt, Joseph Hutton and the Dust Bowl. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. As Tan said, I am Gwen McCausland, and today we're going to be talking about Joseph Hutton and the first soil scientist, or one of the first soil scientists of South Dakota, and his work with the drought. So Joseph Hutton, to begin with, he grew up in a farm in Indiana, and this was in the 1870s, and his growing up working on his uncle's farm as well as his father's farm really kind of laid the foundation for his interest in soil. His uncle had a very healthy, rich soil farm where his father's had a poor soil farm, and so he saw the yields and the changes and differences within that soil structure. He also went on to get a teaching degree and taught in rural schools, which helped him with his later career as a college professor and also communicating with a lot of the farmers. He had a very eclectic education where he had a degree in botany, a master's in geology. He also studied geography, and he taught meteorology as well. In 1911, he became the professor of agronomy at the South Dakota College of Agriculture and Mechanic Arts, which is now known as SDSU. One of the most influential soil scientists that really laid the groundwork of what we know today as soil science is Cyril G. Hopkins. He was born in Minnesota. He grew up in Estelline, South Dakota. He also taught in rural schools and almost died in the children's blizzard. He later on graduated from SDSU and then was the assistant in the agricultural chemistry department. He graduated from Cornell and was a chemist of the University of Illinois Agricultural Experiment Station. He then later became the head of agronomy department of the University of Illinois, and this is where Hutton then later met with him. So his main philosophy was permanent agriculture, and he really believed that if the art of agriculture has ruined the land, then science must restore it. You have to realize at this point of time, in the early 20th century, the idea of ecology was brand new. Dr. Coles, he was the one who created this concept, and that a lot of times, even within the USDA, they believe soil was universal and that it is an endless resource, which Hopkins believed that it wasn't. It was a source that needed to be preserved. So in 1910, Hopkins gave this presentation titled Science in the Service of Agriculture at the University Academy of Science. And this is where Hutton specifically heard this talk, and it created a eureka moment for Hutton. It was a shift in paradigm where it took all of his eclectic education and it fit in soil science. Because what Hopkins was presenting was that Permanent agriculture, which we'll be talking about in a minute, is where a farm never wears out. Soil health is the source of all life. This was a real fanatic idea, and that soil conservation is the greatest material problem to be solved. One of his favorite sayings is that saving soil is only second to saving one's soul. That's how passionate Hopkins and then later Hutton and Hume were about soil science. And of course, Hutton, he often said, some people were converted only to religion, but I was converted to Hopkins' philosophy of agriculture and never have been a backslider. Also, Hutton really believed in education and making sure that people knew about the different aspects of soil, especially meteorology, geology, botany, zoology. And he believed that if you had that broad understanding of the sciences, then you would have a greater understanding of soil. And that's what he really pushed with his students. The other person that was really influential was Hume. Hume was a plant geneticist, and he was a friend and colleague of Hutton and Hopkins as well. And that's where, when they were both introduced to the permanent agriculture, he worked with Hopkins and Hutton while at the University of Illinois. When he became the department head of agronomy in 1911 at SDSU, he solicited Hutton to follow him to South Dakota. And then when he became the first director of soil science survey, he then, of course, placed Hutton in charge of the field work. So Tom is going to be talking about permanent agricultural systems.
So, Hutton had this experience when he was in the last semester of his master's degree program in geology. And he went to hear Hopkins talk. And Hopkins, something happened at Hopkins' talk to change his whole life course direction. He was thinking, I think, of going into teaching in a normal teacher's training school. After listening to Hopkins speak, he changed his whole life direction and dedicated himself to teaching soils and extending soils, all based on the idea of a permanent agricultural system. Now, why? What do you think might have happened that made that, in that talk, that made him switch his mind? Well, he had all this background, all this information. He came from a farm background. But I think that's that system part. He had all these little pieces. And that's, Hopkins put it all together. Now, Hopkins himself said that he did not originate any of the parts of the system. It wasn't original for him. But what it was unique was putting them all together and putting them into a system that was based on soil. Now, what was, I'm going to go through 6 of his points, or 6 parts of his philosophy. And so we'll look at that now. Excuse me. The first point, like that element of this permanent agricultural system was that was based on the investigation of soils. Both Hutton and Hopkins said that everything should be based on some sort of measurement or some sort of factual knowledge. And both of them really pushed for a soil survey. Hopkins started one of the first soil surveys in the nation in Illinois, and Hutton, when he got to South Dakota, that's one of the reasons he was there to start up a soil survey. He really pushed for that to get money from the state legislature, and they wouldn't do it. So it was like pulling teeth in order to get that going. But he really believed in making measurements and experimentation before one moves along. The other thing, the second point, is that the idea that soil is complex. And the idea that soil is not a reservoir where you put something in and then take it out. It's made up of biological, chemical, and physical interactions. They knew that at that time. Of course, they didn't know as much as we do now. A third point was that, and this is very strong for Hopkins because he was a soil chemist or a soil biochemist, that materials removed must be renewed. And when he looked at 10 different elements, he found that nitrogen and phosphorus were always very short. And they also believed that, also found that the organic matter was something that was being depleted. In fact, Hutton in 1931 said of the soils that he had looked at, 50% of the organic matter had been lost in 50 years. And the nitrogen, about 25-30% had been lost. Now, in order to get these up, they believe that one should use natural processes in order to do this, especially with the nitrogen and the organic matter. Actually, the two are very much related to each other. Of this, soil management was critical for them. So they had these different components. But it wasn't enough just to have the components. You need to have them put in place based on the knowledge of the soil. And there's just, I've got a number of them listed there, but there are others as well. Depended on, again, whether you were in a livestock system or a crop system. And this also included informed additions of fertilizers. Now, at that time, both Hutton and Holmes did not recommend using commercial formulated fertilizers. This is primarily due to expense, but they were also concerned that it might continue the degradation of the organic matter. And that's because you wouldn't be putting enough of the commercial formulated fertilizers at the time did not have enough nitrogen for the plants to grow, but they also felt that it might stimulate the soil and maybe provide the nutrients for the plant, but the organic matter would continue to go down if you stopped doing some of these other management systems like using legumes, cover crops, and so forth. Another point is they felt that soils, farms, and fields are different. This was something that was not universally thought of at the time. There were people who thought all soils are the same. In fact, when he started doing the soil survey in Beadle County, they questioned, why do you need to do this? All the soils in Beadle County are exactly the same thing. But we know that that's not. And they also said that this permanent agricultural system is not a recipe or a formulation. It was something that had to be applied uniquely to each setting, based for what they hoped to have in the future with a soil survey. And the idea was one size does not fit all. And then finally, they believed in an ongoing learning process. So just a quote from Hopkins in 1916, "We must always be open-minded and ready to change our opinion tomorrow if justified by additional investigation with accumulated trustworthy data." Okay, let's now go back and move from the early 1900s up to the present. Are we looking at, for the being based on investigation of soils, we have a really good soil survey now. And the soil survey is at the point where it can be used in terms of developing management systems on an individual field, something they didn't have back then. We now know that soil is much more complex, even more complex than what they thought. In terms of materials removed must be renewed, it's almost a given to us anymore. But probably what's a little bit, has been a little bit weak is that we have ignored the natural processes that they were emphasizing at the time. But we have that opportunity to renew that examination. And soil farms and fields are different. That's the basis of the precision agriculture and precision conservation. It all relates back to the soil survey and this idea that we need to treat things differently and not as a recipe or a formula. And then finally, the ongoing learning process. That is something that we see in the development that's needed for the development of a system. Things change. We need to base those ideas on facts that are trustworthy. And the idea is that they should be held together in a system. And what do we have today? Well, today we have regenerative agricultural systems, conservation ag systems, but this has been a weak point in the intervening years, where instead of looking at the whole system, we've just looked at individual parts and just sort of put them as tools that we use randomly. Well, maybe not randomly, but instead of looking at the whole system. So the idea of looking at a whole system, it was important to Hopkins and Hutton, and it should be important for us today as well.
So as Tom talked about, that all these fundamental elements that we use today and we take for granted today was right at the beginning. And this was 100 years ago, where they are educating farmers of these same processes. So again, their main thing was soil comes from all life, or from soil comes all life, understanding the type of soil, crop rotation, cover crops, listing fields, shelter belts, replenishing nutrients. This was all what they were trying to bring to the South Dakota farmer. And they were not only educating farmers, but also students at the college. And at this point, they were really trying to get the message out, and at the same time dispelling those myths that it was an endless resource. As we mentioned, the first soil survey was from 1917 to 1924, and Hutton was very, very frustrated that the legislature would not renew his soil survey, and was constantly hit with that this wasn't necessary, that we don't need to spend taxpayer dollars, it'll be fine, soil will always be there, don't worry about it. But he really spent years trying to get the legislature to fund the survey so that they could finish it, so they could give educated advice to the farmers that were requesting it. Then it started with the drought. For South Dakota, the drought actually started in the 1920s, and it lasted up until 1941. So they had 20 years of drought. Annual rainfall dropped by 75%. It affected the Great Plains from Canada to Mexico, and the upper Great Plains was the worst drought conditions compared to the south. So you might think, well, Oklahoma and Texas and Kansas had it really bad, but no, they actually just got a lot more national coverage. And we can verify this we had a graduate student come up from Baylor College in Texas, where they were studying the effects of the drought versus here. And she was totally excited about our research notes that we have from Hutton, because of what he collected, also verified their findings. But also in January of 1929, this is how forward thinking. So Hutton's already been dealing with the drought for 10 years. And then in 1929, on his radio show, Hutton outlined two visions of the future of farming in South Dakota. One having disastrous consequences, and the other one having a positive outcome. He predicted that the state would be in serious erosion problems if the soil conservation practices were not put in place. Little did he know that that the drought would extend for another 10 years, and that there would be a huge economic downfall a few months later. He did know that organic matter and poor farming practices meant for the destruction of the soil in South Dakota, and he called for change, but unfortunately it went unheeded. And he said, "For almost 25 years I've been crying out against this ruinous process, but in most cases have been met with jibes and jokes and even sneers on the part of the people of our Commonwealth, often from legislatures. And they have said, oh, that soil will all be with us. We can study it when we have more money, when the taxes are not needed for something else." But in 1935, the Soil Conservation Act was signed by President Roosevelt, and this provided funding to address the erosion and flooding issues across the nation. Hutton was one of the founding members of District 7, and the act provided this funding for Hutton to continue his work and study the effects of erosion. Dust storms. The great thing, quote, Hutton talked about how the one thing in South Dakota, the wind never stops. We all know that. It still does today. And with little rain and high winds, dust storms became very common. Some dust storms were so strong that they were called black blizzards. They blocked out the sun. And in the most famous one was in April 14th, 1935. There was not too many accounts of heavy rain following the dust storms of the 30s, and the notorious storm of the Dust Bowl era happened. They called it the Black Sunday. It was caused by a powerful and well-organized cold front that swept down from Canada. So unlike the derecho that happened like last summer, the thunderstorms pushed that dust, and it was but this was a Arctic air that came down and no rain, where the derecho had rain that came after it. This was not thunderstorms, this was just cold Arctic air picking up the dust. And to dispel the myth, it was not soil from Kansas that dumped onto South Dakota, it was South Dakota soil that was up in the air. Hutton was really great with photography. He used it, he was as a hobby, but he really enjoyed documenting the effects of erosion across South Dakota. I call him the Ansel Adams of soil science, because he took really great photographs. And he also was really detailed in his notes. So here he documented various conservation methods as well. How many people are here from Beetle County? Anybody? Not a single one. Oh, one. Okay. Okay, well, you might recognize some names, and he didn't have always kind words for certain producers, so no offense. So here is in Valley Township in Beetle County, and he states, cut and uncut corn in the same quarter section. The soil in the cut section background is unprotected and is blowing out rapidly. The soil in the uncut section foreground is protected and not being blown out. The wind velocity when this picture was taken was about 26 miles per hour, October 15th, 1935. This is one of my favorite ones. This is a transient or vagrant that is walking, and it is, this one was taken in Iowa Township near the Shoe Creek area in Beetle County. The man is walking into 26-mile-an-hour winds. So I feel bad for that guy, because I don't know how far he has to travel. Hutton worked with with South Dakota farmers to implement soil conservation practices. And coming from a family farming background, his experience as a rural school teacher he was able to really connect with producers who may be weary of ideas from the government or from scientists who never worked on a farm. He was really great about publicizing about the various implements of the recommendations of soil conservation. Here, the Soil Conservation Service, which is now NRCS, had a booth at the South Dakota State Fair, and this tabletop display is a model of August, and I think it's pronounced either Youngman or Jugman, farm in Beetle County near Woolsey, before he implemented recommendations of the Soil Conservation Service. And note the drifts. The drifts are so high that the horses are going over the fence. This is August's farm after he implemented the conservation plan and working with the Soil Conservation Service. He also had listed fields, if you notice where the small grain and sweet clover was planted. That was an emergency soil erosion practice, and where you plant perpendicular to the wind. He also documented and studied erosion. Here's Fred von Saragen's farm, September 10th, 1935 in Tripp County. In 1928, Fred purchased land included in the allotment of Lucy Noisy Creek. By 1935, Hutton noted that the blowing soils and drifts around the building were up to about 20 feet. The house was furnished but abandoned. So just within a few years of after purchasing the farm, he had to abandon it. Here's another version or direction of his buildings. The back view of the barns. The dirt was piled up so high that one of the roofs caved in under the weight. The Karnstrom family farm, ultimately, they too were a family that were trying to implement Hutton's conservation practices, but they ended up having to abandon the farm. They ultimately moved into Huron and then later into Iroquois. Their farm, before they abandoned it, they were able to get, the farm was able to get shoveled out from the WPA came in, but then it kept getting filled back in by their neighbor. Lena Jefferson also abandoned her farm near the Woolsey area in Beadle County. As you can see, the drifts are actually even choking out the weeds, which you wouldn't think would be possible. This view of Lena Jefferson's front yard. It was taken from her second floor window. Hutton notes that the Geister farm, which is the neighbor, which is around a mile away, buried her land. And you can kind of see in the very far background buildings from the Geister farm. So the Geister farm also buried the Karnstrom farm. He also then buried the Stegman farm. And so this one is the Stegman farm in Woolsey area, South Dakota. Cattle eating oats on listed land. Blowing on this particular farm, a field was stopped by listing land at right angles to the prevailing winds. But the sand from the neighboring Geister place beginning to fill in, and oats listing and pigeon grass have stopped the blowing away of his land, and the farmer is getting some returns by grazing cattle on it. Hutton was very blunt in his notes about his frustration with non-cooperating farmers. So in the red is the Geister land, and that he was a non-cooperating landowner. He didn't believe in soil conservation, but his land, his topsoil, then blew and buried each one of the farms that had an X, and then the Stegman farm was the other square. So he ended up basically taking all of his topsoil and burying all of his neighbors, which they ended up ultimately having to abandon because after so many years of not being able to get a crop, they ended up having to abandon it. A lot of them abandoned their houses fully furnished because they were only able to carry with what they could fit in a truck, and they headed west, or they got jobs with the WPA, moved into town. And according to this particular image that was taken by the Life magazine, the Evans family was from Lemon, South Dakota, and they had to abandon their farms due to locusts and to the drought, and so they were heading out to Oregon, and they were expecting in this to get to Yakima, Washington for hop picking, and they live in a tent and make about 200 miles a day in their Model T Ford. So from 1930 to 1940, South Dakota lost a third of its population. When the drought hit, again, it was not only just the 10 years, it was 20 years of drought. And it didn't take long for what didn't burn up in the crops, the grasshoppers ate. And they used to say the grasshoppers ate everything but the mortgage. The number of foreclosures also skyrocketed. The one thing about Hutton is that he was really a Renaissance man. Not only did he take photographs, but he also wrote poetry about soil. He wrote many articles. He not only published for the Extension Service, he had regular press releases for newspapers, but he also had his own radio show just about soil. That's how much he loved and was passionate about soil and getting the word out. And he would often give presentations where anyone would give him a platform. He also was really passionate about educating and having it available for everyone. He believed that women should have the right to education, should have the right to vote, and he was very progressive in his way of thinking. So his legacy is still contributing to science. His efforts in soil health and conservation resulted in the formation of U.S. Soil Conservation Service District 7, which also includes South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming. Hutton was a member of the committee of agronomists who developed the international standard of measuring and describing soil colors, but he cannot be understated that what Hutton was developing and doing 100 years ago in the teens, 20s, and into the 30s until his death in 1939, he was giving us the same information that we are still talking about today. But if the state of South Dakota had finished the soil survey when requested by Hume and Hutton in the early 1900s, the knowledge could have easily prevented the permanent damage of the soil in South Dakota during the 1930s. His research also continues on today. Not only do we have an exhibit called Drowning in Dirt, Joseph Hutton in the Dust Bowl, opening in March 2nd, having our exhibit reception, and then we also, and which is open to everybody, it's free to open to the public, but it will also be on display from March 23rd through August of 2024. This will become a traveling exhibit once it goes off display at the museum and will be available for any museum, library, school, any public forum that would like this for a display. The other great thing about Hutton's collection, so in 2016, Hutton's grandchildren, who were in their 80s and 90s, had several boxes of just papers and photographs, and they said, we don't have any descendants. Would you be interested in this? And we'd be like, yeah, we'll take whatever you want. So they brought it in from Oregon, is where they were living at the time, and we were blown away. It was over 1,000 pages of research notes, photographs, you name it, it was there. We had bound books. He typed up every single one of his speeches and he bound them. So he recorded one of his radio programs, and so we have that recording and we've digitized it. And those soil notes and research notes are now becoming a project that, working with the NRCS, South Dakota, SDSU, and I just saw, you want to talk about it, Chris, a little bit about the project?
Sure, if you don't want to. Or...
Well, I'm not the soil scientist. Eli, you want to talk about it then? About what work you're doing this summer?
I can, yeah.
Okay, so we're conducting research. Eli's conducting research, but I'll tell you that the big thing about it is the research is not only just going to be published within the university. We're developing a hands-on science exhibit about soil health and soil management that integrates Hutton's work as well as understanding soil management with today's history or today's science. So Eli, do you want to talk a little bit about the research that you're doing?
Sure, do you want me to?
Yeah, you need to come up and actually use the mic.
Want to get the microphone too? Okay. Okay. So if you were wondering who's looking at all this data that Hutton collected, it's me. So as they talked about, there's soil survey notes that Hutton did in the 1920s, along with other experiments. A couple of those experiments was he did a soil fertility study where he looked at carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and he looked at those levels in cultivated and uncultivated fields at the time, and that was in the 1920s. Back in the 90s, Dr. Tom Schumacher went to those sites again, and they published an article on that. So my research is going to be going back, revisiting those sites again. So we'll have 100-year changes in those properties. So I'll specifically be looking at carbon. So it's going to be looking at the carbon loss from a gradient of 100 years to 70 years in the 90s, and then it'll be 100 years once I reach the 20s. But A whole other part of my study is I'm going to be taking the soil profile descriptions and the field notes from the initial soil surveys that Hutton did, and I'm going to be re-describing those soils. So, that's re-describing those soils, and the main goal is to look at using clues in the soil morphology descriptions, figuring out how much soil we've lost in that time. So it's pretty rare to have pre-Dust Bowl soil information, especially descriptions and morphology information in such detail that we have. So it's a really unique experience and opportunity to see 100-year changes in soils. So that's what I'm working on right now, and that'll all be on display when that exhibit opens in 2024.
Not this one.
Yeah, in 2024.
The other one.
Yeah. So, yeah.
And we'd like to thank NRCS for funding that research. Just want to put a little plug. And so that particular research will be in an exhibit after Drowning in Dirt has closed. So we are going to be doing a real strong push about soil health for the next 3 or more than that, 6 years, because the other exhibit will be up for 3 years itself. So thank you, everybody. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
You mentioned, and maybe this is more of a soil science question, but that the soil survey would have been a preventive measure to take against the Dust Bowl. And I'm wondering how that could be utilized today, as we are seeing similar issues, which was brought up in the previous lecture.
Yes, well, the soil survey today it's a much finer resolution, so you can apply it to a field setting, and it has a lot of physical, chemical characteristics of the different soils, and so you can look at those soils, and there are practices that are recommended for some soils that are not recommended for others. NRCS relies on that very heavily in order to develop parts of a system for a particular field. And also to the whole farm level, if the landowner or farmers are willing to go with that. I should say too that there was this talk about the art and science, but it's actually a combination of the two. You have the science, and then the art is placed on top of that. So a farmer who's utilizing this science as a basis still has a lot of creativity to apply to their setting. So a farmer is very much an artist based on some science background. And it's that link between the two I think is very important.
And I'd also like to point out that what we're hoping to also drive in is that this message is not something new, that what we're talking about today is not new. This is 100 years, and that it didn't all develop in a vacuum, that it's important to know where we've come and where we still need to go, because there's this baseline information is still not fully understood by a lot of people. And so I think our goal is not only to educate producers who are working the land, but also making it available to the general public who may be looking at utilizing soil conservation within their yard or within their garden. And so we're hoping that we can broaden the audience as well with this, as well as our other exhibit. Yeah?
Are there plans to publish any of his journals and photos?
Yes, so our goal is to get them, like the photographs are scanned, and we're planning on putting them on the Digital Library of South Dakota, so that'd be free and open to the public. I believe they're being transcribed into non-handwritten, there's like a lot of data.
Painstakingly, yeah.
Yeah, painstakingly, lots of data, 1,000 sheets. And of course, they're all handwritten in pencil. So a little side note, sometimes cursive is not always easy to read, especially for younger generations who aren't used to reading bad handwriting. So and then of course, they're not, to just put it all together and organizing it will take a while. But yes, that is the ultimate goal, is to get this available to the public. Yes.
He published like a lot of his poems. I have a book of his poems.
Yes, Soil and the Soul.
Yes.
Yes, and that his poetry, that exhibit, that Drowning in Dirt, is actually partially funded by the Humanities Council, because we integrated his poetry and his photographs talking about soil science and the Dust Bowl. And so it's that integration of the art, the science, the humanities, because it is about not only history, culture, and science, and that's what Ag Museum is all about, is integrating all of that. There's another question? Yeah.
I'm not a farmer, nor a scientist, nor an artist, just a curious bystander. Why the reluctance, with so much data available, why the reluctance over your lifespan anyway of teaching, the reluctance to the farming principles and practices in our state and other states?
So he's asking about what's the reluctance of people not adopting these practices?
Based on science and the information that is available. I live in farm community and I don't understand it.
Well, I don't know if this addresses your question directly, but notice that I talked about all these practices, and Hopkins said that he didn't originate any of them. What he did was put them into a system. I think what has happened is that the idea of a system is weakened over time. We really need to look at the idea, the big picture. How does everything interrelates? But when something new comes out, one concentrates on that new tool, and that you don't necessarily look at how that impacts all the other aspects of the operation or of the soil. For example, the whole period of using nitrogen, commercial nitrogen, that came about after World War II, and I lived through that as on the farm, where my uncle was a fertilizer salesman, right? So that was a really big thing, and so that really is sort of like lights in your eyes. The things that we did on the farm gradually disappeared. We had a 5-year rotation on the farm. We had permanent alfalfa. Our livestock was all integrated. We had cover crops related to nitrogen anyways, it's clover. All that was in there, but when these new things come out, you just concentrate on that, and you lose sight of the big picture. And I think that's happened. Of course, there's other answers I could give to that question, but I think that's a really big one that we don't think in terms of systems.
I think one of the most amazing things that I've discovered over time with Gwen Narcios is that we have the image that farmers are very independent people. But I've never met a group of people that are so influenced by their neighbors. So their neighbors can tell them, you're not tilling your soil, that looks terrible. And it really impacts their decisions. Social things going on in that community, because they are somewhat isolated, they just have their neighbors and their small communities, are incredibly pervasive in keeping people doing the same thing over and over, even though it's not working for them.
Well, even in the 30s, there was a belief that if you plowed, it'd bring rain, and that if you a good farmer had a clean field, you didn't leave a single stub on there, and so that was also shifting that paradigm. This is what Granddad always did. I knew this one guy. He was a student of my mom. She taught chemistry, and she's like, well, when do you put nitrogen on your field? Well, when my neighbor does. Well, have you ever tested to see if you need nitrogen? Well, no, but my neighbor did it. I'm sure we have the same soil. So there you go. So that's how changing those myths.
I should add that Hutton addressed that same problem. And
It's throughout his notes, constantly. Was there any other questions?
I hate to cut it
Oh, I'm
off,
sorry.
but
Yeah.
in order to keep us all on schedule, I should get you moving back into the main ballroom where we came from. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you,
Brandon,
everybody.
for your time.